previous guests have talked about lots of different understandings of the nature of the divine, use lots of different language to describe what that is like and what their experience of the divine is. I wonder if you can tell me what God is to you.
God for me is like this grounding of like love, like that love is really at the center of everything, even though it does not feel like it most of the time.
Sure.
That love is at the center of creation, and the fact that we are loved is like at the center of who we are and how we're invited to like be in the world. And I think that's probably very powerful for me because I was also a tiny perfectionist who like got a lot of my self-worth from doing well in school and like wanted to be this like teen writing prodigy. And then that it didn't happen, right? Like I applied to Princeton and these schools that I didn't get into, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, I did all this work and like put so much of my identity into being this good student. And no matter how hard you work, you still might not get what you want. And then who are you then?
This is Uncommon Good, the podcast where we chat to ordinary people doing uncommon good in service of our common humanity. My name is Polly Reese. Fam, I am 100% delighted to bring you today the Reverend Megan McDermott. She's a poet. She is a stand-up comedian. She is an Episcopal priest currently working in Massachusetts. Here's your content warning for this episode. We talk a lot about Christianity, Christian supremacy, late-stage capitalism, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So as always, viewer and listener discretion advised. We go on to talk about our shared experience growing up in very Midwestern feeling central Pennsylvania. We talk about rural and suburban small towns and communities, specifically the values of those communities that we embrace and some of the ones that we let go of. We talk about the nuances between different Christian subcultures and how they formed us as kids, looking at you, Christian pop culture, toys, and music. We go on to talk about the relationship between Christianity and late-stage capitalism, more on that Christian pop culture, what it was like for her to become a layperson and work with young people as a clergy person during the pandemic, and her books, Jesus Merch and Woman as Communion. This was a privilege to get to talk to my old Yale buddy. Please enjoy my chat to Reverend Megan.
So first and foremost, number one, like it's insanely hot, and you work in a church. You work in an Episcopal church as a priest. So that means that you're melting under like lots of layers of liturgical fabric.
Yes. And I feel like it's a position probably a lot of clergy and churches are in because our old buildings, which are lovely and beautiful, are not designed with air conditioning. And,
Right.
It's challenging and expensive to outfit them with air conditioning. So we just have huge fans. But if a fan is too loud, then you can't hear anything, and so we have to turn the fans off for the sermon and then turn them back on. So it's a whole process, but it's amazing. People show up, and I think I might be looking at the temperature and deciding not to show up, but people still show up. So maybe that's inspiring. Maybe that's how I should be at it.
I love the idea of like people like coming for any number of reasons. I mean, I guess community, to whatever like patterns like that help them like feel good and have like a good start to their Sunday, and that also like they inspire you too.
Well, and the other amazing thing about vestments is people don't really know what you're wearing underneath. So you can kind of, all think, is this dress too short for church? And then I'm like, well, they won't see. So, I could go all of Sunday without anyone actually seeing my outfit. So at least I have that to fall back on of like, I can wear something somewhat cool under the vestments because no one's going to know what's under there.
For someone who is unfamiliar with the term vestments, can you describe like what that would look like and what it feels like to wear something like that?
Yes. So vestments are basically uniforms for clergy, and
Sure.
they're also things that people who are serving up at the altar wear. And so at my church, that usually looks like essentially a white robe with, it's called a cincture, like a white rope kind of around it. And then
like a low-tech belt.
Yeah, what would the non-church equivalent be for stole? It's kind of like a scarf.
Yeah.
A little scarf that matches the colors of the different seasons. So it's a little toasty if it's hot. Winter, you get extra layers though. So
Right.
But in the summer, it's a little hot. But it does kind of like set you apart and enter into a different mode for worship by like having a costume change essentially.
Yeah. So two reflections. One, I'm thinking of like the robe depending on like what church you go to. I'm aware that it might be like a robe that sort of like crosses the front and has like some sort of closure in the front. It might be something that's more like a bleached white muumuu that just pulls over the head. I'm imagining like a crossover between like a liturgical vestments store and like Uniqlo, or like some sort of like pregnancy line, like maternity line. One.
It's not the most flattering thing in the world. Yeah, that's accurate.
The other thing that comes to mind is that clergy are perennially dressed for pumpkin spice latte season.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah.
Like there's the scarf that's heavy but not too heavy. There's like the overlayer. If it's like really cold, like you might put on another thing. Depending on like what sort of liturgical tradition, you might have something that goes around your wrists or other ropes or fancy belts that you wear. Yeah.
Lots of layering. Yep.
The other thing that I immediately wanted to jump to is that you and I have some sort of like childhood geography connection. Like we both grew up in like deep central Pennsylvania. And I think you said the town that you grew up in was Lewisberry. Is that correct?
Yes, Lewisberry, not Lewisburg or Lewistown. Lewisberry, which is like 15 minutes outside of Harrisburg.
Was this like suburb, medium town, small town, or like outpost in the middle of farmland?
I would say where I lived was suburb. I think there is a town that's very tiny of Lewisberry, but where I lived in particular was like a suburban development, basically.
Got you. The thing that as we were talking became increasingly clear that of all of those things we hold most in common and probably have the least like traumatic memories of, potentially even great memories of, is Hershey Park.
Yes, Hershey Park. It's funny, my parents were just telling me the other week that they're going to go to Hershey Park on their own, and I was shocked. I was like, did you even like going when I was a kid? They've been watching a lot of YouTubers who like go visit places and just record themselves. So they're going to go to Hershey Park without me. So I'm interested to hear what their experience is like. But yeah, I went with my family, dragging them to go. And then, of course, we had a couple of field trips. We had our big 8th grade field trip to Hershey Park. We had a physics field trip to Hershey Park that was all about doing physics problems, but not really. And did you ever go to concerts at Hershey?
Yes, I did go to concerts. Tell me about your favorite one.
I went to this is revealing my very sophisticated musical taste. When I was 15, for my 15th birthday, I went to a concert that was Corbin Bleu, Allie and
Ooh.
AJ, and Drake Bell. That one was exciting. I went to Demi Lovato with David Archuleta as the opener, but there was a thunderstorm, and so David Archuleta performed like as much as Demi did, but still enjoyable. And then the Jonas Brothers featuring the cast of Camp Rock 2. So seeing a trend.
You were a Teen Nick kind of girl growing up.
Teen Nick, Disney, all about it. All about it.
I remember I was a Teen Nick girl growing up as well, but I think of a slightly earlier era, like thinking in the realm of like the first days of Snick, right?
Yep.
Are You Afraid of the Dark? Oh gosh, Roundhouse, the Ren and Stimpy show, and like the earliest season of all that.
Oh wait, you know what I've rewatched some of since the pandemic? Kenan and Kel.
I'm not 100% sure, but like I feel like Kenan Thompson is the next like Dick Clark. That regardless of how old he gets, he will always look the same until someday, like out of the blue, tragic passing, and we're all like, nobody knew anything was wrong.
And he'll always be working.
Like
he's not going to ever be out of a job. Yeah.
He will always be the elder statesman of sketch comedy. Like they will make like they'll make like the I don't know, like the Masters League of Saturday Night Live, and they'll only hire people who are over the age of 55. And Kenan will be there and will look exactly the same as he did when he was first hired for all that. Like, so Central Pennsylvania, what was it like having that be sort of like the origin location of your story? What was it like to grow up there?
I feel like my area of Central PA was very like on that line between suburban and rural. And I think kind of both suburban and rural culture like kind of coexisted in the geographic area I was in. And I think it really depended on probably your family, your exact neighborhood, class, etc., whether you really had a rural experience or like a more suburbia experience. Because I remember one of my good friends from college, she came to my parents' house once and she said, they said,
right,
you know, they weren't like taking us to the farm show or immersing us in kind of the more rural aspects of things. So like my experience was very suburban, but I think some of my classmates in school growing up, like some of them had much more rural experiences, and I think we might describe the culture there differently.
So first and foremost, like that sounds like the location for the real life Desperate Housewives, right?
That'd be interesting. Yeah.
In one geographic location, it's so easy to have so many different experiences. Like your friends that spent so much more time in the more rural sort of, because yes, like outside of Harrisburg, as soon as you get like 10, 15 miles outside of Harrisburg, like it's farmland, rolling hills, like very sort of Midwest, maybe even in some places, at least for me, Appalachian.
Well, and when I go back, I particularly, you know, when I was living in New Haven and would like go back to Pennsylvania, it was kind of jarring, like the lack of diversity and the realization that I didn't really reflect on that when I was growing up. But like, I remember, you know, being at a bar restaurant with my family and like looking around and being like, every single person in here, as far as I know and can tell visually, is white. And then realizing that's like always been the case in almost every space I grew up in. I was not as conscious of that until I was in other environments that were more diverse. And then you go, oh, this is like actually really kind of strange. You know,
it's a there's something about the world. I'll describe a similar experience of like like visiting central Pennsylvania, yes, you don't notice some of those things until you have something else to compare them to. I think racial and country of origin diversity is definitely one of those things. One of the things that you told me about growing up in Central PA is that you were raised in like the sort of like Catholic worship environment. I wonder if you can describe what that component of growing up was like, how you see elements of that reflected or not reflected in your work today.
From a fairly early age, I was kind of attracted or interested in church and in prayer. I remember in elementary school, I did my first communion, which is such an interesting tradition now, being in the Episcopal Church, where for the most part we don't kind of celebrate it in the same way, because you have the little girls in like these wedding-esque dresses, which is like at once very odd, and also I look back on my pictures, I'm like, oh, it's so cute. It's like weird, but so I did that. I did CCD, which is their like Sunday school equivalent, but it happened during the week. I tried to acolyte for a while, and I remember they put me on a team, and so they didn't rotate through like where you were with different kids every week. You were always with the same team. And my team was me and 3 siblings who all went to Catholic school, and I went to public school, and who had been acolyting forever. And I just felt like I am not, and I hate fire too. So I think I like hated trying to light the candles. It stressed me out. I was an acolyte dropout, and now I'm a priest. When I was, 6th grade or so, I remember researching all the world religions, and I was like seeing if I wanted to switch, because I just got it into my head at that like young age, like, oh, I don't want to believe something just because my parents do. And then I remember being like, oh, I still like Jesus, so I guess I'm going to be Christian, which felt kind of anticlimactic 11-year-old self. But I started going to like a Bible study some people at school were doing, which looking back, I would say leaned like evangelical, non-denominational. I don't think I like really comprehended that at the time.
Yeah.
But it was the first time I was really exposed to the idea that like your religion could be a core thing about you, and not just like one among many demographic facts about who you are. And that like, that the Bible has something relevant to say to us in our lives. Like, I didn't really get that feeling from my Catholic church growing up, and I didn't really necessarily get that from my parents either, who like, they prioritized having us go to church. And I know that they must have prayed with me, because I remember praying as a child. Yeah. But I just remember kind of being introduced to that Bible study and feeling like, oh, there's another level in which I can enter into my faith if that's what I want. And so I kind of knew, even as I was getting confirmed in like 8th grade, I had it in the back of my head that like, maybe I'm gonna like want to be Protestant when I'm an adult. And but you go through with it anyway, because you're 13, and like, how do you articulate that to your parents or whatever? So I think by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of tackling faith on my own, which I think was not the healthiest thing. Like, I was still going to church. I was often the one being like, Mom and Dad, let's go to church. And they were like, okay.
One of the things that I'm so curious to explore, like in these conversations, is what we use the language of prayer and faith very comfortably. But the more time that I spend talking with people about these deep sort of like, not just like things that we do or places we attend, but things that impact us on like that sort of gut core level, the more I realize there are subtle differences that are there that we don't always explore because we assume that when we use those words, they're always like everyone understands what we mean when they're different. So when you think about like this language of faith, can you say more about like what that means, at least to you now?
Okay, to me now, and not
if you can access what it means to little Megan.
I mean, I remember one of the most powerful things for me when I was like in my early teens was like the idea of a God who I could just be my real self with. And so I really put on an act, I think, even to myself sometimes, of like, I don't care what anyone thinks about me. People can make fun of me. I don't care. Like, they're just shallow. Like, and I just remember once it was at this like Christian worship festival that I ended up going to with some of the like people from my middle school Bible study, and having this moment where I was like, it's okay for me to like be hurt by things. And like, it's okay for me to be honest with God about that, and to not have to all the time be like this strong, I don't know, defiant person. Like, I think it got me in touch. I don't know. I've always been an emotional person, but I do think it got me in touch with my emotions in a different way than I was letting myself. And kind of drew me into trying to be a little more gracious with other people, because I think I felt very judged at that age. And so I judged other people really harshly. Like, I was a know-it-all. Like, I look back and I'm like, I can understand why I probably ruffled some feathers of people when I was that age, because I think I thought I was smart and deep, and these other people weren't. So I think back then the idea was huge to me of like having God, or like who's beyond me, and is who I'm able to open up to in a way that I can't necessarily in the rest of my life. And I mean, I think that's still a part of my faith too.
That's so illuminating. I hear like a sense of like the capacity, like a place that is safe enough to be, as you said, vulnerable, and to be the truest version of Lil Megan. There's your stage alias for your stand up. But that you could be.
And at the same time, like, as I tried to pursue, what does it mean to be a Christian? As I tried to pursue that more seriously, the more like toxic ideology that I was coming in contact with in, these Christian books and magazines aimed at teenage girls, or some of the like contemporary Christian music at the time, like Barlow Girl, like their lyrics are comically atrocious in some songs when I look back. So I think on some levels I was connecting with like this liberating, comforting part of my faith. And then on other levels, I was getting really anxious about like, what does it mean to be a good Christian? Is it having to be perky all the time and happy and joyful all the time? And like, what does it mean as a woman to like, as a young woman at the time, a girl, what is my faith asking me to do? And so I think as I tried to lean in to this faith that was really compelling to me, it was also cultivating anxiety about like, I can't live up to this image I'm getting in my head of like what a Christian is supposed to be.
I want to lean into a little bit and try to understand a bit more is what the role of prayer is in the language of faith. Can you say a little bit more about what prayer was for Lil Megan?
Yeah. I look back and I'm like, I feel like prayer was very anxious. It was like, I was afraid of like people I loved going to hell in a way that I am not now, because I think I was buying this narrative of like, if someone hasn't like very specifically given their life to Jesus in a specific kind of way, that they're like in danger. So I feel like I was praying for other people who I felt like were in danger, and I was praying for myself because I felt like, I remember thinking, I don't know if I'm cut out to like be a Christian when I'm an adult. Because I just remember so many periods where I felt doubt, but then I felt guilt about the doubt. And I think that's the thing that really gets you stuck, because like questions and doubts are like a part of life. But when you start having fear-based reactions to like your own thoughts, you know, it's not spiritually, I think, healthy or fulfilling. So I think a lot of my prayers were like, wanting myself to be different, wanting other people to be different. I feel like that's really far from how I think today. I think I also was very much like, I don't know, concerned I wasn't praying enough. And I think sometimes today I'm still concerned I'm not praying enough, but it comes from a different place. I think now, when I'm like, oh, it really would be helpful for me to like have a more regular spiritual discipline, I'm usually thinking about it in terms of like, that's what my soul is craving and could like flourish with, rather than I think God is mad at me because I'm not praying enough.
There's a cruel, incongruous thing that I think that I hear there, because you talk about prayer being this thing where there are specific ways you're supposed to do it. There's a certain quota that you have to reach, although nobody knows what the exact number of that quota is in order for you to have done enough. And it makes you. You talked about little Megan feeling a certain way, like feeling a lot of anxiety, when the relationship with God, with the beyond, the great divine that you described, was all about the piece of feeling the most authentic of self, which was decidedly like the work of releasing like anxiety and releasing the school front of Lil Megan.
The way that I look at my faith has changed for the better is that I think particularly kind of in my college years, kind of having this realization that like, why would the God who has created like everything like want to shove us into these boring, predictable boxes of behavior, especially around like gendered behavior? Like the idea that, you know, God would want me to be like only this very particular kind of woman, and every woman who is Christian should be the same type of woman. Like when you think about it, it just like doesn't match, I think, the broader vision of God that, you know, I see in the scriptures and that I feel like I've encountered in my life. Like I think I came to believe that like God empowers us to be more boldly who we are, and that like that doesn't mean sometimes we don't like do fucked up things, but like that God is making me more of myself rather than less, and making me more my unique self. I think that was an important shift for me to realize. And if I didn't, I don't know if I definitely wouldn't be a priest if I didn't have that shift. And, you know, who knows if I would even be involved in church at all if I didn't kind of have that change and what I saw God's purposes being in our lives.
I would love to continue on from that point, like the purpose of God in our lives. And previous guests have talked about lots of different understandings of the nature of the divine, use lots of different language to describe what that is like and what their experience of the divine is. I wonder if you can tell me what God is to you now, and because of what that is, how that gets you to this work of being a priest in Amherst, Massachusetts.
It's a good question. It's a big question. Let's see. For some reason, the thing that's like coming to my mind right now is some of the work that I do with youth in my parish, and just how important it is to me for them to have a space where they're being told, what you achieve, however you want to measure that, is not the most important thing about you. God for me is like this grounding of like love, like that love is really at the center of everything, even though it does not feel like it most of the time.
Sure.
That love is at the center of creation, and the fact that we are loved is like at the center of who we are and how we're invited to like be in the world. And I think that's probably very powerful for me because I was also a tiny perfectionist who like got a lot of my self-worth from doing well in school and like wanted to be this like teen writing prodigy. And then that it didn't happen, right? Like I applied to Princeton and these schools that I didn't get into, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, I did all this work and like put so much of my identity into being this good student. And no matter how hard you work, you still might not get what you want. And then who are you then? I think I remember being confronted with that going into my freshman year of being a creative writing major and like wanting to be the best. Realizing that was not always going to be the case. There are going to be people who are better than you, or by some standard, or that you might perceive as being better than you. And so what is the stable ground on which I could build my identity and sense of worth? And for me, that's God.
That's beautiful. I'm just sort of reflecting on the sense of stability and how powerful a simple sense of stability is, and frankly how attractive it is in a world that is so full of instability.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned to me as we were getting started is that the youth have different needs and concerns around faith formation now than what they did in the past. I wonder if you can tell me more about that.
Well, yeah, I think some of it for me is just comparing like the religious context that I grew up in, growing up in the Catholic Church, and then also just the cultural context of being in Central PA. And Amherst, Massachusetts is very different from Central PA, and it's the Episcopal Church is very different to grow up in, I think, than the Catholic Church. So like for me to like really come into a denomination that had women's ordination and like to realize I could do that was like this wild thing to me, right? These kids have had women clergy and have seen women clergy, preside and preach their whole lives. That just is normal to them. And I think there are lots of things that are just normal to them. Like always surprises me. Like I did a little lesson. I think this was back in there was a year where we were all virtual at church because of COVID, and I was doing Zoom youth group, and we did this video and discussion on faith and science, and the idea of the material was to kind of encourage youth to be able to see those as going together and not as automatically being these conflicting things that are butting heads, which, at least in my experience of growing up in Central PA, I think is a narrative you hear a lot of, I can't believe in evolution because I'm a Christian, or I don't want you to teach my kids evolution because we're Christian, or things like that. I just remember asking them, like, if you've ever like seen these things pitted against each other. And they were like, well, maybe on TV. And I just went, oh, yeah, because they're, in a pretty progressive part of Massachusetts. Yeah, I'm always striving to hopefully facilitate some like level of personal connection to their faith and to scripture. And we're a very academic community in Amherst. So we have a lot of faculty and staff from Amherst College or Hampshire or UMass who are a part of our community, and a lot of kids who have parents who are professors. And so I think sometimes their temptation, if we're talking about the Bible, is to approach it in the way that they would in like a lit class, like where they want to get the right answer. I don't think they always approach it that way, but I think, it's that academic background, I think could be a good thing. And it can also sometimes stifle you from like entering into a text that you don't feel qualified to interpret. I mean, and I think this is my like inner Protestant soul coming out, where I'm like, you all can interpret the Bible, like you all are capable of it. So yeah, I think there are, and I think their context is also like, it's much rarer. It's much more rare to like have a Christian identity and be an active churchgoer at their age than I think it was at my age growing up in Central PA. I think it was still fairly rare to be like pretty serious about your faith or like talk about it a lot. But I feel like the default assumption was that like everyone was kind of Christian. And that's not the default assumption here, which is like a good thing, because not everyone is Christian, right? So you don't want to assume that everyone is. But I imagine it shapes the way that they see church in themselves a little bit, to feel like it's not the most common thing in the world, maybe, for them to be Christian or to be going to church.
I'd love to hear more about the difference between like the world that you see where you use the language of default Christian, where there are assumptions of a certain level of familiarity with that sort of, with those practices, at least what I think you're getting out of going to church, like the practice of like having a life that includes regular attendance at church, some sort of like religious observance, versus a culture where that isn't the case. I wonder if you can describe how you feel like the culture is different when there isn't the assumption that everyone is regularly going to church and is at least a little bit familiar with that sort of lifestyle.
Like, talking about it now, like, I think I often perceive it as like a geographic thing, but I also think it's a trajectory in time that is happening throughout the US and many places, right? Of like, as people who are connected to the church, we hear these narratives about church all the time. And as younger people, we like know from just our social lives that like it is somewhat rare. I think well, actually the other day I was at Amherst Coffee, which is like a bar cafe in Amherst, and I started talking to this couple. And they were like my age. The guy was an Episcopalian, and we like freaked out. We were like, "Oh my!" And because it just like seems rare, right?
Yeah.
Like that like you don't necessarily expect when you're just going out about in the world and not like at a church-related function that you're going to come across a young adult who shares that identity. So I think it's difference happening on two levels, right? Of like, I think the religiosity in this part of Massachusetts is different from where I grew up, but it would also be interesting to like eavesdrop on the conversations about religion from like high schoolers where I grew up, because probably fewer and fewer of them have grown up in churches, even there. That's an assumption. That's like a wild guess. But yeah, I think in terms of how that shapes ministry, I think I'm always thinking about what, particularly with youth, but I think this applies more broadly across all the demographics of like, what do we offer that you can't get somewhere else? And so I think I probably lean into a lot more conversation on faith, maybe, than some models of youth ministry, because we like do fun things too. Like we'll go this past year we went rock climbing, indoor rock climbing, and
Sure.
mini golf, and all those like classic youth group things. But it was also important to me this year. We had monthly discussions, usually over lunch, and we did a set of lessons around faith and wellness, and like how faith intersects with the way that you care for yourself spiritually and mentally and emotionally and physically and so on. I hope that they'll experience something distinctive that like the Christian tradition can offer them, other than just like service projects and fun, which are great, but like you can easily get those in a lot of context.
Yeah.
So I think about that a lot of like, am I teaching or guiding conversation or making opportunities for them to make a personal connection with kind of the Christian tradition? They'll all have their own journeys, right, of figuring out, especially as adults, what they believe or not. But
right.
Yeah.
What do you think it is that is distinctive about the Christian tradition that is not offered, or at least hard to find elsewhere?
I think to be motivated to really stay and put up with all of the interestingness of church, especially as a young person.
That's the nicest way I've ever heard that put, incidentally, yeah. By the way.
And, like, as a young person in the main line, where like they might, wherever they might end up living, they might be the youngest person in the church by decades, right? If they decide to go. But yeah. I think you have to find something compelling about Jesus, I think, to like want to keep showing up in the spaces that, I'm involved in. And to me, like, I mean, the most compelling parts, and I'll unpack the theological language, but are the incarnation and the resurrection, of like the idea that God so wants to be with us and be close to us that like God came on earth as one of us and like was present with humanity in that way. To me, that's a compelling vision of God. And then the concept of resurrection and the idea that like ultimately life and love and God will triumph over death and grief and injustice, and the hope that is represented in that while our world is like falling apart, and while we're called to like take actions to like, we're not called to just, be passive and hope and wait for the resurrection. But I think to me, that's a fueling idea of like, even though it looks like all of the terrible things in the world will always win, like, I don't think that's true. Right. On some deeper reality, I think that like love and life and God are more powerful, even though that doesn't always appear to be the case. And so for me, I think those are the like pillars of what is attractive or compelling about the Christian story. Yeah.
I hear so much hope and just a sense of resolute optimism in that, and I suppose not a small commitment to imagination as well, in trying to envision a world as you're describing, that is so much better and than the world that you see in the moment.
Yeah. Well, and this is like my creative writing background, I think, but I see priesthood as really being about storytelling in a way of, how do we proclaim this story of God and God's people that I think we find in scripture. It's a complicated story in scripture, but
Sure.
How do we proclaim that story in a way that connects with people today, and how do people then connect their own stories and their own ways of interpreting their life and their world to that story? Like, how do we help people see themselves as a part of that bigger narrative? And I think that was one of my big draws to the priesthood, was the idea of working with story in that way. And sometimes, just reminding people of like the story of a God who loves them, because it's not always like new information, right? When you're preaching, like it's not like, oh, I need to come up with the most unique interpretation of this passage ever. But sometimes I think it's just in presence or in preaching, just like reminding people, like, this might be a story you already know, but like, God loves you.
I want to turn to this work, this career that you've developed of creative writing. We met at Yale Divinity School, specifically Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, the Anglican Studies wing, and the Institute of Sacred Music. Thank you, Martin Jean, and Chris Wyman and Maggie Dunn and all of those wonderful people who were there at the time. And then I know you're also a very brilliant poet and hymn text writer. What was the story of that developing, and these two ideas of ministry and creative writing sort of merging together into this work of priesthood as storytelling?
I think writing, I've been in love with writing forever, since I was 6, 7, and, consistent throughout my childhood. That was my dream of like being an author. And people knew me as like that writer girl, in part because I had this amazing 3rd grade teacher who I showed her a short story that I wrote, and she like put it in the library for other kids to check out, which I just look back, I'm like, that's so sweet. And then like in middle school, the people would bring it up to me and I would like cringe. I was like, ah.
Yeah.
So I've always loved writing, and that was initially what I planned to study in college. So I went to Susquehanna University, which has a great creative writing program. While I was there, I ended up like adding first a religion minor and then like getting really into it. So that was kind of going on at the same time, this like opening up, I think, of my mind in terms of how I approached reading the Bible, how I approached thinking about my faith. And at the same time, I started getting really into poetry in college. I think it's much harder to like tackle ideas in the same way in prose or in fiction. I think you can, but it's like, I think you have to be very talented to pull it off in a not didactic way. Whereas poetry felt like it was more fit for wrestling with the things I wanted to wrestle with. So I started writing a lot of things about like women in the Bible back in college that have ended up getting published now. So that was really, I guess, the start of the focus on poetry. And I think kind of going into seminary and being at Yale, I was always still like occasionally writing and sending things out to lit mags and getting published here and there, and like figuring out if I'm going into parish ministry. So I feel like once I actually got through seminary and, started my life here in Amherst and started my ordained life with some of that more settled, I feel like I've been able to explore again more of the poet vocation and calling, because I'm not like actively in as great a level of discernment as I was about ministry,
Sure.
right? So I think I just was super social in New Haven. Like I just was always bopping around somewhere.
Sure.
And I think I just have more time to write now that I'm not like surrounded by other human beings constantly. And yeah, so in the past few years, I have been really happy that like, I've had more poems published and now have
Yay!
had 2 chapbooks, which is just a fancy word for tiny collection of poetry.
Yeah.
And have a full length collection, so like a normal size book. So it's called Jesus Merch, a catalog in poems. And it's coming from Fernwood Press, which is a poetry imprint of Barclay Books, which is a
Wow.
small Quaker publisher out in Oregon. Early in the pandemic, I was trying to find things to mail to children from church. So here's an example. I don't think I ever gave these out. I'm holding up a little cheap penguin that says Jesus warms my heart.
We'll put it on the YouTube channel and on
Yes.
the Instagram so that people can see it.
Oh wait, these are the things I really love. This, one of my friends calls this the nerdy Bible. It's a little plastic Bible with arms and legs and glasses on. This actually did get sent out to kids. And I have, of course, extras on my desk because I love them. But
I love it too.
I was looking through this online catalog of like cheap kids Christian stuff, and there's just so many weird things that they sell. And so I think the first poem I wrote, it was this inflatable beach ball that was like construction themed. Oh, it was supposed to be an inflatable wrecking ball that's like Jesus wrecks my sin or something. And I sent it to a group chat of my friends. And this is why it's always good to have writing community, because I was joking. I said I should write a poem about this. And they were like, but you have to actually write a poem. So I wrote a poem about that. And it was really fun to write. And so I decided I am just going to keep looking for weird things on this website. And I'm just going to write until I don't feel like writing them anymore. And so early COVID, everything's locked down. I just wrote, I don't know, 40 poems or something from this website. And so I knew I was writing enough for it to be going towards a book, but I was like,
Wow.
I need to bring in some variation in here. And so what I ended up doing pre-COVID, I had visited the Yale British Art Center, which I love. I love the Yale British Art Center and the Yale Art Gallery. And there was this exhibit on Victorian board games, which I found fascinating. And I bought like the big art book that they sell about the exhibition, which I had like never bought anything like that before, because they're kind of expensive. It was like a $60 book or something.
Oh,
but
wow.
I just had that, like, my creative energies were like, I need this. So I bought it. But then I'm pretty sure I had it just like in my apartment sitting for like a year, because I knew in the back of my head, I was like, I want to write something about these. But it took writing these other poems for me to realize, oh, these can go together. So I wrote some poems based off of the Victorian board games, because obviously a lot of them have religious messages in them and a lot of kind of like Christian content. And then my third kind of source that I brought in was just looking at Etsy and eBay for like 20th century Christian games and Sunday school stuff. So I have things from the 50s and the 20s and the 80s that people were selling. And so, yeah, I think initially it was about kind of exploring the implicit theologies in these like commercial items that we sell, have sold, bought, or whatever.
A connection between American Christianity and late stage capitalism?
Yeah.
Get out of town.
But then I think what ended up being really interesting is like, I think someone could write a book that was just like a critique of all these things, but that just wasn't that interesting to me. Like, there are poems that are definitely critical of some of the messages of the merchandise, and then there are poems where in the weird item, or like I find some connection to my life in some way, and it becomes like a dialogue partner for like something that I'm going through. So to me, I don't know, there was something that captured me in a lot of these weird, cheap, mass-produced items, and like leaning into that for the sake of the poems. So yeah, that's kind of how that came together. And yeah, it was really different because I like wrote it all as a project as opposed to like my chapbook that just came out, Woman as Communion, was me like putting together poems I wrote over the course of like 7 years and trying to like see how they connected and fit together. Whereas this was like, I kind of wrote feverishly for a couple of months, and I knew that I wanted it all to be one project and come together.
That's amazing. The phrase that comes to mind when you talk about mass produced like little toys like that in a religious sort of target audience is made in China, but for Jesus.
Well, and the name, I mean, and I always am like, why won't they change the name of this? The company is Oriental Trading.
Oh no.
And I'm always like, why wouldn't you update your name? Like, because I have some history of the company in the author's note, and it, I think it was founded in the early 1900s by a man who's a Japanese immigrant, and like, so he named it that, but I'm like, why hasn't anyone since been like, maybe it's time to change the name?
Gosh, so many. I remember so many like childhood days, like because like we were the family that did all the merchandising for like Sunday schools, getting like the Oriental Trading Company like print catalog
packet,
exactly, and like all of the glossy pictures of like the censored like church safe versions of like all of like the fairground games and like the little toys. And
because I think if I'm remembering correctly, I think they started out with like carnival materials as what they sold, and then they like transitioned into Sunday school. That might not be right. I'll have to look up to make sure that's right. But
I feel like some religious scholar in the PhD in religious studies department at Yale is now going to do like a detailed like dissertation about like the impact of the Oriental Trading Company.
They should, because I think it says a lot, like what we like give to children, right? And like what we sell as representative of different stories of our faith. I'm trying to remember, like there's one, I forget what the actual product was, but I just remember it was about Mary and Martha. And it was like Martha is like frowning and angry, and like Mary's smiling, and it just sell that story to kids.
If there's anything that I've learned about what work I've done in children's ministry is that kids are 100, maybe 1,000% smarter than what we give them credit for sure.
Yeah.
I want to talk about one of the specific expressions of your writing that you told me about and that I saw on your Instagram that you picked up during the pandemic, and you turned to stand-up comedy.
Yes. So I had been wanting for a while. There's a comedy studio like 15 minutes from where I live.
Nice.
And I had been wanting to do their stand-up class pre-COVID. And it was always like sold out every time I tried to register.
Sure.
And then this past fall, their classes opened up again, masked. Nice. Everyone required to be double vaccinated. So they were doing it as fairly safely for being in person.
Sure.
So I signed up, and I think my main motivation was just like I wanted to be around other people. And having moved in the past few years to like a new place, your attempt to like make a social life gets very interrupted in a global pandemic, naturally.
Right.
So I think that was my main motivation. To me, there was something very freeing about the class, because obviously I like get up and speak in front of other people on a regular basis when I preach. But to me, that's like, there are stakes to that, right? Where I'm like, I want to be offering something useful for people. And I'm like also aware in the back of my head, like, I'm hired to do this. Like, people are paying me to like offer up something worthwhile.
Sure.
And to be able to just have a venue where, I could get up and talk for 5 minutes, and like, it does not really have any consequence for my life if I bomb, or like if what I have to say is like not very relevant, or, it just like doesn't matter. And I think, share different parts of myself that I would not necessarily share from a pulpit or in a parish setting.
Sure.
So yeah, and it was interesting because a lot of like what I ended up writing about for my stand-up class was often things I have written poems about, but like just coming at it from a different tone. So I feel like my first chapbook that came out was called Prayer Book for Contemporary Dating. And it was a lot of like dating and relationship poems that like have some elements of humor to them, but like I think are relatively like sincere.
Sure.
They're not written to be funny. I think some funny comes out, but
there's a different tone when you're writing for humor or satire.
Yeah.
And I imagine also the experience both of writing about and then the actual experience of dating as a clergy person must be fertile ground for poetry and comedy.
Yes. Yeah, and I think towards the end I took three sessions of the stand-up class where I was like, I have to start talking about something else, because it's just like the most obvious material, because you just get laughs from like people don't expect at all for someone who is a priest to go up and honestly say anything honest about, or like swear. Like, just me swearing, which, like, if someone knew me in my social life would not be, like, a shocking thing. But you just get a lot of easy mileage out of it, I feel like. So towards the end of those classes, I was like, I have to challenge myself to, try some other material. Yeah, it's different to approach something with the thought of, like, okay, how can I present this in a way that just is funny and that people can enjoy the humor of it. So I did a little hybrid poetry reading / stand-up set a couple of months ago with my new chapbook, because it's just had been something I wanted to try, because I feel like they're in conversation with each other. I think it went okay. I would like to try it again at some point.
Yeah.
And I sold a couple books, so
Hell
to
yeah.
my comedy classmates. So but I'm interested in how those things could possibly come together in my life.
Oh boy. Well, one, I would pay to see like a stand-up poetry slam. That would be amazing. Two, I wonder, I know we talked about this like a tiny little bit. I wonder if you might be willing to grace us with a reading.
Yes. So this is called To Adam. Adam, I now always tack a sigh to your name, a stand-in for more precise feelings. I know I shouldn't be mad still, but I am. It's personal, not principle. That you were the one to betray me, the same one who shared conversations unlike any I'd known my whole life. Forget that my life was only a day old. Forget that you were my only option. It was still extraordinary. The opening in me meeting the opening in you. To be fair, we didn't know how to be closed yet. Now we have learned to hold words under our tongues, vary the angles of shoulders, narrow and soften eyes. Adam, remember the way you kissed my tears, though we didn't know what they were yet. That my body had guessed at truth. No apple needed to intuit that perfection was temporary. You pressed your lips to each drop, telling me God had said you could drink of any water, all was yours for the tasting. That was the start. You tasted me in the dark, and I tasted you back, and we didn't know shame yet, but it still seems special. Adam, you didn't even call me by name, the woman that you gave me. During those talks we had, the ones we'll never have again, you said it over and over. Eve, Eve, Eve. Each time like a key finding its proper slot. But now all words are different. And when I hear you repeat my name, it's ownership, irritation, lust if we're lucky. Recognition of us as separate two, bound together by guilt and circumstance, unable to repeat the miracle of that first day, staying up all night talking, bright with the hope exclusive to those who don't yet know the need for it.
Woo! That's gonna sit with me. The thing that strikes me about that is that at least in my experience of reading that story, as very reflecting on the text that I've read, like it's a very visceral story. Like it's a very intimate, very deeply personal story, but that because I suspect probably of the context in which I'm used to reading it, like it's not something that you think is very embodied or incarnational.
Yeah, well, and I shared this in my like poetry stand-up set, but it's been a while, so it's not going to come off funny, but that's okay. I actually wrote that poem when I was writing a lot of poems about men and like people who had broken my heart and like just a lot of like angry poems about guys, and they were not good. And I was like, what? I like had all of this like negative energy about, my romantic life, but I was not happy with how the poems were turning out. And I was like, how can I like do this in a more creative way that will like channel that energy, but also allow me to step back from like the personal details. But I was like, I can just pick men from the Bible who I feel like are disappointing in similar ways to how men have disappointed me. and I will just project my personal disappointment onto the like biblical characters. And so, and it's also funny because I'm not exactly sure which guy I was really angry at when I wrote that poem. But I like know that is there in the background, that like I was thinking about a very personal story and situation, and I was fusing that with the biblical narrative and where I saw it connect. Yeah, I was at one of our classmates, Greg Johnston, who is a priest in
Yes.
Boston. He had me come do a reading for his church, which was so lovely. And it's funny because I'm like reluctant to read my poems to my own church, but at someone else's church, I'm like, yep, let's go. And someone asked me like how much of the voice of like the women characters in the poems, how much of it is like actually my voice and how much is actually me. I feel like poets are always reluctant to answer that question.
Yeah.
But I think it definitely varies by poem. I think it's natural that, you know, I'm interested in these poems and exploring these women characters who like are not very fleshed out. But I think, yeah, then they probably do get fleshed out with like parts of me and my experiences, and you know how I would be feeling if I were in the midst of, you know, that biblical narrative.
Well, I'm so grateful that you read. The book is called Woman as Communion, and I'm assuming anyone can get it anywhere where they get books.
Yes, it is easiest to get it probably from my publisher's website, Game Over Books. It's in a few bookstores, but you can always request it at your bookstore or library if they don't have it. But
amazing. Well, as we're coming to the end of our time, I just have one more question for you, and that is, what do you want the world to look like when you're done with it?
Oh, it's a good question. I think something I've been thinking a lot about lately is like, how do I phrase this? Making spaces that making spaces that give people the opportunity to like connect with themselves, to connect with their spirit and with God in like an open and exploratory way. And I've been really kind of fascinated by using the arts and literature more in parish ministry, which is something I feel like I was doing with our youth already, but have been doing more of for adults in our congregation as well. So like right now we're doing a weekly poetry meditation, and I have a different contemporary poem every week, and then I basically pretend I'm Padre Gotuma of Poetry Unbound, if you're familiar with that. I give my little reflection on the poem, except we're on Zoom live, and then I give people reflection prompts, and we like have time to meditate and pray, and then we come back together. And for me, that's the most interesting part, because people open up in a way that I don't think they necessarily would do without having something to respond to, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, people share these personal things, or they'll share about their like perspective on God that the poem brought up for them. So I don't know. I guess I want to do more of that, of like creating opportunities for people, to connect with themselves and with God, and to like share in that with other people. Yeah. And I think the other thing in terms of like parish work is just like, I hope people feel that I cared for them, you know, that the congregations I was in, you know, at the end of the day, you know, none of us can do this work perfectly, but that people can feel like, yes, Megan loved us, and cared about us. Yeah.
Beautiful. Megan McDermott, thank you so much for being on the show and for lingering with me a bit today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Hey fam, it's Polly. If you liked that video, want to join the conversation, be part of this community, click the subscribe button so you don't miss a thing uncommon good. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.